Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Wednesday, January the 17th, 2024. You're listening to the Joseph Banamy Show. We have not been on for quite some time, so I guess the first thing I should do is wish you, I feel a little uncomfortable wishing you a belated Merry Christmas, but I think I can wish you a belated Happy New Year. We're not quite 3 weeks into the new year, so it still kind of feels fine if you're asking me. So, belated Happy New Year. Thanks for joining, and we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. Some housekeeping items, some updates, etc. So we're going to get right into it. So the first thing that I think that I want to bring to your attention is, of course, since we haven't been on for a while, the question is, why haven't we been on for a while? And that's because we wanted to retool the show. Retool a little bit, regroup, kind of figure out where we were going with it to make sure that everything was basically going the way that we wanted to go. So that's I don't even know why I'm using the term kind of. That's for sure the way things were going. And we're quite pleased with them as it stands right now. I got so many windows open here in my computer, and I'm just trying to minimize a few of them as we go along the way. So let's see. Just bear with me for a second, ladies and gentlemen. Oh my goodness gracious, I just have so many windows open. And there we go. Okay, got it. All right. So, as I was saying, we wanted to retool the show a little bit. We were doing a daily show, and we're not doing a daily show anymore. We're doing a weekly show from now on. Once a week, Wednesday nights from 8 to 10 Eastern Time. And the reason that we're doing it like this is because, to be perfectly blunt, it's easier. Doing a daily show takes a lot of work. This is not a full-time occupation for me. And if it was bringing in the shekels, that would be one thing. But it's not. That doesn't mean that it brings nothing in, but we're trying to basically keep things under control here from a cost point of view. So we want to make sure that everything that we're doing actually works out, makes perfect sense, etc. Okay, so weekly show. The other interesting thing about this is that from now on, we are going to also accept phone calls. So if you're watching the show on YouTube, or you're watching the show on Rumble, or anywhere you're catching the show where you can actually see the video graphic, you can see the telephone number to call in. So I'm going to give it to you now, but don't worry, you don't have to rush out and grab a pen or a pencil, because I will give it to you again verbally over the course of the next 2 hours. And that's the second thing, or the third thing that we've done. We've gone from a weekly show, or from a daily show 4 days a week, to a weekly show on Wednesday nights. We're now going to be taking calls so that we can interact with you, the audience. So that's another important thing. And the third thing is that being a weekly show, we're going from, for the time being anyway, 1 hour to 2 hours. And that gives us a little bit more time to develop different ideas, delve into some of the issues that we want to talk about a little bit more fully. So it should be interesting. So that's kind of the, good grief. Housekeeping, not health keeping, housekeeping side of things as we move forward. And of course, I haven't done this for a few weeks, so I might be a little bit rusty. So bear with me. A couple of topics that I really want to get into tonight. The first is the question of Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, won the Iowa caucus down in the United States. And there's some polling that's out here in Canada this week with regards to Canadian attitudes towards the United States election. It's an election year in the United States. We're going to get into that a little bit. But my question to you is really, how much do we really care? How much do Canadians really care about what's going on in the United States, whether Donald Trump is indeed going to be the nominee for the Republican Party in this election year, presidential election year? So that's going to be a question I want to get into tonight, a little bit about American politics, etc. The second thing, very controversial and very timely, and that is immigration. I don't know if you've been following the immigration issues here in Canada, but there are serious questions now that are being raised at the governmental level, ironically, about our immigration levels. The plan over the next few years is to bring in 500,000, that's 500,000 new Canadians every year for the next few years. And that doesn't include temporary workers, that doesn't include foreign students, it doesn't include a number of other categories, it doesn't include refugees. So that's just one category, landed immigrants, 500,000. Is that a good idea or is it a bad idea? And what is the implication for a number of policy areas? Well, we're learning here in Canada now that this is something that's been going on, a debate that's been going on behind the scenes at the government level. And when I say the government, I'm not talking here about the elected government. I'm not talking about Justin Trudeau. I'm not talking about Parliament. I'm talking about the public service, the bureaucracy, and the mainstream news organizations. I know if you're listening to this show and you happen to be a strong right-wing conservative, you probably don't trust the mainstream news organizations. And I'm not going to encourage you to change your minds about it because I really don't trust them entirely either. And I don't really think they do a good job. That's a subject for a different evening, different discussion altogether. But I do have to give credit where it's due. And in this case, I have to say that the mainstream news has actually been pursuing this story a little bit more effectively than they have in the past. And there was an access to information that was done in order to obtain documents surrounding some of the discussions that have been ongoing at the federal government level or within the public service. And again, hasn't affected in any way. Well, no. Let me walk that back. It has affected a little bit what the government policy is in certain areas with respect to immigration. So we're going to get into that as well. And again, what are the issues around immigration? So those are the topics I want to get into. Before we do that, I do think that there's a couple of things that we need to talk about as well. Some unfortunate news. As you all know, or if you're, again, a regular of the show in the past, you know that one of the people that we've had on from time to time is our friend Nick Vandergraat. Nick Vandergraat, former talk show host here in Ottawa, where I'm broadcasting from the flagship station CFRA. For, I guess, about 15 years or thereabouts, he broadcasted weekly talk show and sometimes did daily. What were the show's names? Nick at Night was one of them, and Sunnyside Nick as well, Sunday mornings. Anyway, as you probably know, Nick left CFRA a handful of years ago and dabbled in a few other things, continued to do broadcast through an online show that he and I were doing together. So we did a show for 5 years together, Nick and I. Started out, we called it the Combat Zone, and then we just, switched it to the Nick and Joe show because we figured, what the heck, we're the talent. Why wouldn't we do that, right? Why wouldn't we take advantage of the fact that we're the talent and promote ourselves? So that was the idea. And we did that for, I guess, about 3.5 years. The Combat Zone lasted about a year and a half. It was the same show, we just rebranded it. Anyway, Nick, as you probably know if you've been following the story, moved out to the first Northern Ontario, and he would do the show remotely rather than here in the studio. So we still continued our show, and more recently moved to the West Coast. Nick had a dream. His dream was he wanted to get back out on the water. As you probably know, or maybe you don't, Nick is an ex-Navy fellow, spent 10 years in the Royal Canadian Navy, although it wasn't called the Royal Canadian Navy at that time. It was during that time when we weren't considering ourselves to be royal anything, but it's now been reconstituted as the Royal Canadian Navy. Thank you very much to Stephen Harper for doing that, and the government of Stephen Harper, as well as the Royal Canadian Air Force. So anyway, Nick spent 10 years in the Navy, then decades on land doing different types of jobs in addition to his talk show that he was running on CFRA. And his dream was to get back on the water, so he always wanted to buy a boat and fit it out and live on the boat. And he and his wife moved out to the West Coast. They bought a boat, had to refit the boat, and this is where the unfortunate news comes in, ladies and gentlemen, and that is that over the course of doing the refit, when the boat was in dry dock, Nick had an accident. He fell off the boat onto the concrete dry dock, and unfortunately, he's currently in the hospital. This was a few weeks ago now, and he is in a coma. So he has. We're all hoping and praying that he's going to recover. But if you're looking for out of control, this was the new, now that Nick moved to the West Coast and was getting settled in, we decided that we would rebrand the show, the Nick and Joe Show, as Out of Control with Nick and Joe. And it was very exciting. We got a couple of episodes. If you're on Rumble, you can look it up. We got, I don't know, about 4 or 5, maybe 6 episodes altogether under our belt of Out of Control with Nick and Joe. But we haven't done anything in the past number of weeks, and that's because of this unfortunate accident. So a lot of you out there have been asking me about this. Where is Nick? What's happening with him? Etc. Well, that, my friends, is the update. I don't have any more information than that. I have been in close contact with his family and with his dear wife. So if you're a praying man or a praying woman, then I would suggest and ask that you keep Nick and his family in mind in your prayers. And hopefully, God willing, he will recover, and we will have the pleasure of having a show on air again, hopefully in the not too distant future. But in the meantime, we're all thinking of you, Nick, and praying for your speedy and full recovery. All right, I promised you that I would give you the phone number. I have not done that yet. So anywhere in North America, you can call toll-free. The number is 855-391-3661. So again, the number one more time, toll-free, anywhere in North America, 855-391-3661. You can also, if you are catching me on Facebook Live or any of the platforms where you can see the video, you can actually also use your computer to call in. If there should be a link. The platform we use is Call In Studio, and what you do is you click on that link and you can call in, join the show live. All you have to do is, as I say, click on the link and use your computer audio to do that. So you don't actually have to call using the phone. And of course, that's a big deal because if you're not in North America, you probably, you're not going to get through on that toll-free line because it only works in North America. So you can call from anywhere in the world using your computer audio, and that's how you do it. You click on the link, call in studio. Oh, gosh, I don't even remember what the URL is. I could look it up during the break and read it out to you if you're interested. But my guess is that if you're listening to this on the computer, chances are very good that you can access it through YouTube or Rumble or Facebook Live or any of the other platforms where you're actually seeing a video. Okay, so that pretty much covers all of the housekeeping items that I wanted to get into. I don't think there's anything else. Is there anything else? No, I don't think so. All right, so this week, today's Wednesday, this week was the Iowa caucus in the United States, the primary. It's not really a primary because they have this strange thing. There's primary voting, okay, where it's like voting. You go to a place, you cast a ballot, etc. Then they have what are called caucuses. And there are a handful of states in the United States that do the primary, the pre-running. I don't know what else to call it other than a primary, where the different states get to choose the members of a political party who are resident in a particular state get to vote on who they want to be the candidate for their political party for president of the United States. And in some places, as I say, it's done through a normal balloting process. You go to a place, you get a ballot, you mark the ballot, you hand it in. At the end of the day, it's those ballots are counted. But that's not how they do it in Iowa. In fact, that's not how they do it in any of the caucus states. In the caucus states, it's very strange. They gather in various places, church basements, etc., school gymnasiums, and they vote by grouping themselves into who they support. It's a different system, and it's a little bit odd. The mechanism here is not important. How they do it is not important. I'm just saying that, for the sake of interest, I'm just pointing out to you that it is actually interesting how they do it a little differently. So Donald Trump won the Iowa caucus, and that was the very first vote, pseudo-vote, quasi-vote, for the GOP in the United States, the Republican Party, for who they want to be their nominee for president of the United States. Donald Trump wins. Ron DeSantis, had to think of his name for a second, came in second, and Nikki Haley came in third. I don't know how far back Vivek Ramaswamy was, but he's now dropped out subsequent to the caucus. So Ramaswamy has dropped out, and he's endorsed Donald Trump. And so we're going to have a number of these primaries now over the next few months and caucuses. Some states are trying to block Donald Trump from being on the ballot for a number of reasons. Don't want to get into that tonight. This is not about Donald Trump, okay? I'm just sort of giving you the lay of the land because I think it's really interesting. And I think it's important for this discussion to know a little bit of the background here. So Donald Trump, as I say, he won the caucus. And there are some states that are trying to bar him from being for a number of technical legal reasons. I personally don't think that the reasons that are being cited are legitimate, but I'm not American. I don't have a dog in the hunt. And the decisions are going to be, as to whether or not these states are going to be successful, those decisions are going to be made in the courts in the United States. So I understand that the Supreme Court of the United States is going to be looking into this, taking these cases on, and they're going to rule the way they're going to rule. And I would be surprised if they rule against Trump. I would be surprised if they uphold the decision of these states to bar Trump from being on the ballots in these states. That would be a very big shock to me, because I don't think that the case that's being made to bar him from running for president in these states is sufficient. Now, if you're not American, you might want to know just a little bit more about how this works. To run for president of the United States, it is a popular vote thing, but you have to be on the ballot in each state, or you have to be in the ballot in a particular state to be running for president of the United States in that state. So there are 50 states in the United States, and all 50 states get a certain amount of points, which we call electoral college points, that then they add up the electoral college points that are apportioned based on whatever the rules are in that particular state, and the winner of a general election in the United States for the presidency, they're the ones that actually got the most number of electoral college votes. So it's important to understand that, unlike here, for instance, where where I'm broadcasting from in Canada, where you are, well, I was going to say you're running for office, and I guess you're on the ballot right across the country, but the truth is you're actually not, because we have a Westminster system. So there actually is no popular election for prime minister here. But if there was, then it would be you'd be on the ballot right across the country. It wouldn't be state by state, or it wouldn't be province by province. So no single province would have the power to bar any candidate for prime minister. If we had a directly elected prime minister, no single province would be able to ban that candidate for the prime ministership from the ballot in their province. But they could do it in the United States, because you have to be certified in every single state in the United States to be placed on the ballot, even though it's a general federal election, because you're elected in each state. Each state has its own electoral system. So, I maybe I'm not explaining it really, really well, but that's the general idea. So the Supreme Court is going to rule on this particular topic, and I would be surprised if Trump is barred from being a candidate. Okay, so what does all this have to do with us here in Canada? Well, here's the bottom line. The bottom line is, I'm not sure. Angus Reid came out with a poll late last week, and they were saying that most Canadians are concerned about the state of the American democracy. And they're particularly concerned about what is going to happen if Donald Trump is on the ballot, A, and B, he's elected. Now, I do want to get into the ramifications of that, because I think people have it backwards. But my first question is, really, are we really that concerned about it? Are we really, really worried, ladies and gentlemen? Are we really worried that Donald Trump is going to become the president of the United States, and that the United States is going to become some sort of an authoritarian dictatorship? That democracy is going to be thrown out if Donald Trump becomes the president of the United States? Now, if you've listened to my show in the past, you know I am not a Donald Trump fan. If I was an American citizen, if I was voting in a presidential election in the United States, if Donald Trump was on the ballot, I would probably vote for him, because I agree with his policies, most of his policies, And I think that the Democrats, in my view, again, caveat here, I don't have a dog in the hunt. I'm not an American citizen. It's not really my business. But if I were, I would be supporting Donald Trump. But that doesn't mean I like the man. I'm old school when it comes to this kind of stuff. I believe that the president of the country in the United States, I believe that the Prime Minister in Canada, I believe that our political leaders ought to be setting a good example in terms of not just ethics, but just the way they present themselves. Are they polite? Are they respectful? Are they good role models? Personally, my personal view, I don't think that Donald Trump is a good role model. I could see that there could be worse role models, so he's by far not the worst. But I'm not convinced that Donald Trump is, I just don't think he's a very good role model. I think he's rude. I think he's brash. I think he's over aggressive. I think it's very childish, very immature, his style of politics. And I get it. I know it resonates. And I don't want all of you guys who are Trump supporters to start calling me and saying, "Oh, Donald Trump, you gotta." I get it. As I said, I would support Donald Trump. I would vote for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. And that's another subject, by the way. I'm not convinced that Joe Biden is actually going to be the Democratic candidate. It's really hard for me to believe that they're going to have Joe Biden's name on the ballot come November, or whatever it is. I don't have the date in front of me. Hard for me to believe. And there are mechanisms to make sure that the Democrats might end up having a separate candidate. But I think you go through the primary season with Joe Biden. I think that he wins the primaries because I don't think anyone is emerging that's going to be an effective opposition to him. It remains to be seen, but I'm not hearing anything. And then you get to the convention, and then you have somebody popular who is nominated from the floor, from the convention. Doesn't have to be the person who got the most votes. I mean, that's just one aspect of these conventions. But ultimately, the delegates at the convention are the ones that get to decide who is going to be the nominee. So keep your ears to the ground, keep your eyes open. You heard it here first, okay? And when I say you heard it here first, I actually mean that, because I'm not hearing anyone talking this way in the United States. I'm hearing people talk about, questioning whether or not Biden is actually going to be the nominee. I'm hearing that question still. But I'm not hearing anybody saying, wait and see what happens at the convention. It's entirely possible that someone will be nominated from the floor of the convention. So I think that that's a very real possibility. I'm just looking at the clock here, ladies and gentlemen. I think before we continue the conversation, we're going to take our first break. So stay with us. We will be back here in 2 minutes on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And during the break, if you're new to the show, in lieu of commercials, you get a little bit of nice background music. So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for January the 17th, 2024. I am your host, Joseph Ben-Ami, and as I said at the beginning of the show, a belated Happy New Year. 2024. Oh, man, I'm telling you, it's just... 2023 just... Is it just me? It just seemed to blow past us at such an incredible speed, such an incredible rate. Really, I don't know. I'm not frightened by the speed at which time is passing, but I do have to say it is passing at a very, very rapid pace. So at least, that's my observation. So I'm a little surprised at how quickly 23 passed. All right, so where are we? We've been talking about the U.S. Federal election, Donald Trump. That's the story that everybody wants to talk about, isn't it? Donald Trump, the U.S. federal election, etc. There are a lot of other stories out there, but that's the story we're talking about tonight, at least for the time being. I have another subject, as I mentioned earlier, I want to get into. I want to talk about immigration. I do want to talk about immigration and the impact of immigration in the Canadian context, but the subject is broader than that. It's not just Canada, and I'm not referring to the situation on the U.S. border. That's a separate item altogether as well. No, but let's get back into the Donald Trump thing. By the way, again, if you want to call, the number to call is 855-391-3661. I will be giving that number out again, so if you have a chance, grab a pencil, pen, piece of paper. Don't worry, you don't have to rush off right now. I'll be giving it to you a couple of more times if you want to call and join the conversation live. That's one of the new things in this new revamped Joseph Ben-Ami Show. We are a weekly show now, Wednesday nights, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. We are 2 hours instead of 1 hour, which is what the show was before. And we are also taking live calls. We haven't received any tonight, and it's going to take a little while, I think, to move forward on that, but I just want to make sure that you know. So that's toll-free anywhere in North America, 855-391-3661 to join the conversation. And if you are outside of North America, and you could do this anywhere in North America as well, it's not limited to just people outside of North America, but anywhere on the planet, if you want to join in the conversation, but you don't want to call by phone, or you can't call by phone because you are outside North America, as I said, you can always use your computer audio. And if you're watching on the computer, on YouTube, or on Rumble, or on Facebook Live, or any other of the platforms, you will see that there is a URL that you can call. And that URL, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at it, it should say callinstudio.com. I can't remember what the rest of the URL is, to be honest with you. I promised that I would do this. Oh, here it is. I see it right now. Okay, so www.callinstudio, all one word, .com /show/JBA for Joseph Ben-Ami. So if you type that into your computer, you will get connected using your computer microphone and its audio. Okay, so we've been talking about Donald Trump. And we've been talking about particularly Canadian attitudes. At least that's the subject, how I wanted to get into it, because last week, Angus Reid, one of the big national polling companies here in Canada, published a poll where they were discussing Canadian attitudes to a potential Trump presidency, second Trump presidency. And the results were that basically, without getting into all of the nitty-gritty details, that Canadians are concerned. They're concerned for the state of democracy in the United States, the condition of American democracy, and they're particularly concerned about what the effect of Donald Trump being reelected as president will have on that democracy. In other words, Canadians seem to be thinking that if Donald Trump is elected president, that he will potentially destroy or undermine, if I want to use a softer term, democracy in the United States, that somehow or other he could end up running an authoritarian government, even a dictatorship. And where are Canadians getting this from? Well, they're getting this largely from American media, because American media dominates the Canadian media landscape. Let's not beat around the bush. Well, of course, we have media here in Canada, and some of it's good. A lot of it, like everywhere else in the world, is mediocre. But whatever the character of the media is, left-wing, right-wing, good, bad, or whatever, the truth is that the media landscape in Canada is dominated by the Americans. So, if you have cable news here, if you have cable here in Canada, you watch CNN. Okay, you can get the other broadcasters too. You can get Fox News. You can get, CBS, ABC, NBC. You can get all of this stuff. You get MSNBC. CNN is the big one. It's the easiest one for you to obtain. So if you're getting this kind of stuff on American networks, then you're going to be getting it. You're going to be watching it here if you get an American network. So the point is that Canadian attitudes are largely being shaped by left-wing American media. So, for you Americans who happen to be listening to the show tonight, don't get your knickers in a twist over those out of touch, out of control, out of ignorant, unknowledgeable Canadians, because they're not getting this from the media here. They're getting it from the media down in your own country, and because I say, just to give you an idea of how dominant American media here is, a lot of the news reports that we get, even on the Canadian news shows, originate with American media. So, some of the mainstream news outlets here will simply report what is being reported in the United States, particularly in print journalism. So that attitude, that concern, that fear, if you will, is something that's being fomented in the United States, and it's being exported from the United States, or imported, if you want to use that term, from the United States to Canada. So go figure. So don't blame Canadians for having this fear. Is it justified? Well, the first thing is this. Before we really delve into whether it's justified or not, I've just given an explanation as to why it seems that Canadians are having this attitude towards Donald Trump and a potential Trump presidency. Even to the point where the Prime Minister the other day was commenting on it. So, by the way, this is not the worst I've seen. The worst I saw was when George W. Bush was president of the United States. And we had members of Parliament here were just openly saying, "Oh, I hate the United States. I hate Bush." We had one member of Parliament here by the name of Carolyn Parrish, who eventually got kicked out of the Liberal caucus. It was a Liberal government at the time. But there was one television show where she had some sort of a George W. Bush doll, if I recall correctly. So, I'm giving my best recollection. I could be wrong about whether the doll was actually a George W. Bush doll. I'm pretty sure it was. But But anyway, she stomps it. She throws it on the ground and stomping on. This is a member of parliament. Okay, so it's Canadian attitudes, particularly the political sector towards Donald Trump, are they could be better. Okay, but it's not the worst that I've seen. So a little perspective, I think is probably not a bad thing in this case. Be that as it may, okay. Again, as I said, don't blame Canadians for thinking this way about Donald Trump, because they're getting their news and all of their attitudes are being shaped from media sources in the United States. Okay, so the real question I think that one has to ask themselves at this stage is not so much Canadian attitude, because to be perfectly honest, if the way these polls work is it's when you get a call and you get interviewed, or if you're online, you're being interviewed online, or you're filling in questionnaires, etc. You may not actually in your day-to-day life think about some of these questions. Okay, like I could go, and I'm a bit of a political animal, so I've been employed in the political field in one form or another for decades in this country. So, and I could tell you, I could go days without thinking about the American elections and Donald Trump and the presidency, etc. I can't if I'm, following the news in the United States, but I don't get most of my news from American sources, so that's just me. But the point here I'm making here is that even me, who's a bit of a political animal, and I love the stuff I follow, I get engaged, etc. I could go days without ever even thinking about Donald Trump, without ever thinking about the American presidential election. So my guess is that most Canadians don't actually think about this, which means that in the final analysis, they don't actually care. I don't know if that's would be something that's the same in the United States, but certainly here, most Canadians don't care. So if you're an American and you're thinking about, you read somewhere Canadians really are worried about Donald Trump, I don't think the Canadians really care one way or the other. They're not really worried about Donald Trump. If a pollster was to call and ask the question, thinking about Donald Trump and a second presidency in the United States, what would be your attitude? And then they'll give 5 choices, let's say, or they'll say on a scale of 1 to 10, blah, blah, blah. So if you put the question in front of people, they'll have an opinion. But if you're not actually asking the question, if you're not putting it in front of their faces, then my guess is they're not going to have an opinion at all. So, the first question I asked was, do Canadians really care? And I have to say that I think the answer to that is no. I just do not think Canadians care. And I would be surprised if, people anywhere else really care. I'm not even sure how much on a day-to-day basis the average American cares. There's no question, I don't even have to see polling data on this, that Americans care far more. It's the presidential election and the political turmoil that exists in the United States, such as it exists, is far closer to the top of the mind of an American than it is to a Canadian. But if I go overseas, for instance, and I'm asking questions, of people in the United Kingdom, or in Germany, or in France, or frankly anywhere else, give me the 10 top issues on your mind. Tell me the 10 top things that concern you. I would be surprised if most people, I'm sure statistically speaking, some people will say that, they're concerned about the state of democracy in the United States. But I would be surprised if that number was even double digits as a percentage. I just don't think that most people care. They have a lot of things on their mind. So as I said, in answer to my first question, that's my thinking. I just don't believe that Canadians really care as much as the perception of caring seems to be if you follow the polling here in Canada. But here's a really good question. I think this is a question you have to ask yourself, ladies and gentlemen. And that is, ultimately, is Donald Trump really a threat to American democracy? Is there really a legitimate threat, a legitimate possibility that if Donald Trump was elected President of the United States for a second term, that democracy in the United States would die, that there would be an authoritarian, it would be replaced by some sort of an authoritarian state where Donald Trump was a dictator? I just think that, ladies and gentlemen, is absurd. I want to call it a fantasy, call it a nightmare, call it whatever you want. It is unhinged. There is zero chance of Donald Trump becoming a dictator in the United States. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. For starters, and yeah, maybe if you're a liberal Democrat, supporter of the Democratic Party in the United States, you hate Donald Trump, all of those things. If you're listening to the show right now here, this is my observation as an outsider looking in, and sometimes that gives you a better perspective of the real situation, the reality, how things really are on the ground. Americans, you guys down there have too robust a system of checks and balances. There is no way, except through acts of violence, and I'm going to address that in a minute, but there is no way, except through some violent methodology here, that any individual can become a dictator in the United States. No way. The political system, the judicial system, flawed as it may be, complicated as it may be, corrupted as it may have become, there is no way that any individual gets to become a dictator and run a dictatorship in the United States, barring some sort of a violent seizure of power, which is, nobody's talking about that. If there's going to be any violence here, and I've sort of come around to the thinking that violence is a possibility. But the possibility of violence here really comes from the frustration on the part of free American citizens who are potentially denied the right to vote for the candidate of their choice through these shenanigans trying to bar Donald Trump from being on the ballot in different states. Now, I don't believe that most supporters of Donald Trump would take up arms. But I could see that there might be a small number, a very minuscule number of people who could potentially be violent in their protest against what really is ultimately the undermining of democracy. Donald Trump is not a threat to democracy in the United States. All of those people who are trying to prevent Donald Trump from being on the ballot, they are the true threat to democracy. And if they succeed in preventing Donald Trump from running for office through whatever legal shenanigans that they're trying to pull right now, yeah, I could see where frustration could boil over into some limited violence. I could see that. Far more likely is that Donald Trump is allowed to run, he wins, and then you have an ensuing summer of violent protests, similar to what we saw before with Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. I think that that's a very real possibility too. In fact, I think that that's a probability. But in either case, we're not talking about overthrowing the government. We're not talking here about destroying the democratic process in the United States. We're not talking about the emergence of an authoritarian dictatorship. It's not going to happen. And I did say that the only possible way that something like that could happen wouldn't be through using the democratic process. It would have to be through some sort of a violent overthrow, a seizure of power. Well, there's no possibility of that happening either. And I'll tell you why. It's not just because nobody on the right is organizing it. Nobody on the right has, or the left for that matter, has the capacity to mount such a widespread seizure of power. They don't have the resources. The United States is a big country, and I know people use the term insurrection when it comes to what happened on January 6th a few years ago. They still use that term insurrection, but it wasn't really an insurrection. It was a riot, maybe, but an insurrection? No credible, plausible attempt to overthrow the government. Even if that was their intent, which it wasn't, it just didn't happen. But let's say theoretically, hypothetically, that it could happen. Let's say that a faction in the United States, left wing, right wing, whatever you want to call it, put together the resources and an organizational plan in order to seize power by seizing predominantly by seizing not just the institutions of government, but mostly communications, which is virtually impossible these days. But the bottom line is this: even if all of that hypothetically was possible and it happened, the American people would not stand for it. The opposition, the grassroots opposition to the emergence of some sort of an authoritarian regime in the United States would be the final barricade, if you will, the final defense against it happening. Americans, and I don't, maybe if you're American and you're listening to the show, maybe you need to be reminded about this. Generally speaking, Americans don't tolerate that kind of stuff. And it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. They just wouldn't stand for it. So here's the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen. The bottom line is, even if you do care, even if this is top of the mind and you're worried, okay, what's going to happen in the United States if Donald Trump is elected president? I think a better question is what's going to happen if Donald Trump is prevented from running for president. I think that's a far better question to be asking. And if you have to be concerned, that would be the area that you have to be concerned about. That would be the thing that should be concerning you. But I just don't think, as I said, most people are really that concerned. I don't think they're that concerned. And if they are concerned, if you are a Canadian and you are worried about what could potentially happen in the United States, my advice to you is, don't worry. Don't worry. You don't have anything to worry about, ladies and gentlemen. Because it's not going to happen. These are ideological opponents of Donald Trump who are fomenting these fears in order to undermine his political prospects. And there's no need. And look, remember what I said, again, if you've been following anything that I write, anything that I speak publicly about, if you've been following this show in any of its previous iterations, if you've been following Nick Vandergrant and I on our other podcast, you know I am not a Donald Trump fan. So this is me as a non-Donald Trump fan telling you, yeah, don't worry. It's fake. Fake news. I think that's one of the most brilliant terms that Trump came up with. Fake news. Maybe he used it a little bit too much. Maybe he used it a little too aggressively, the terminology. Okay, I get that. But in the final analysis, you got to give credit to, that is one of the brilliant and I think most accurate observations that Donald Trump has come up with in his time in politics. Fake news. Yeah, it's fake news. Didn't happen. I mean, that's the other thing about this, of course. All of these people who are, wringing their hands out of concern and frustration, etc. All of these people that are wringing their hands over what? This isn't something that's even happened. And it's not going to happen. So that is my answer to the question. I don't think Canadians are worried. Don't think they're worried about it generally in the UK or anywhere else in the world. Not even sure how really worried most Americans are. If you ask them the question, they'll have an answer. But this is not on the top of anybody's mind. Certainly not here in Canada. If I ask 100 people, 2 or 3 maybe might say, yeah, this is a concern of mine. If I go to 100 Canadians and I say, tell me what your 10 most items are that you're the most concerned about right now, maybe 3, 4, 5, maybe out of 100, are going to have, even in that list of 10, the political situation in the United States and whether or not Donald Trump is going to be elected president for a second term. And I could pretty much guarantee you that out of that 100 people, nobody will put that at the top of the list. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see, what time is it? Coming up to the top of the hour. So time for a second break. So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show in a little more than 2 minutes. And we are back. Thank you so much for staying with us. You are tuned into the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for Wednesday, January the 17th, 2024. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. I just said thank you for staying with us. So, well, I'll say it again. Thank you so much for staying with us. Okay, second hour of the show. Big thing. It's a big deal here. You know, we've got switched from a 1 hour show 4 times a week to a 2 hour show once a week. Wednesday nights from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. That's to catch the show live. But of course, you know, you can always listen to the podcast. You can go to the josephbenamishow.com. That's the Joseph Ben-Ami Show, all one word.com, where you will have not just the opportunity to listen to the show live during a live broadcast, but you can go into our podcast library and listen to any of the shows from the past. So that's something that I didn't mention earlier, but it's obvious, I think, obvious. And, you know, this show is actually carried on a number of the podcast networks. So you can get it on Apple Podcasts, you can get it on, I think Google discontinued its podcast service, but I'm on Spotify and any of the major podcast platforms. So yeah. Anyway, enough about Donald Trump, enough about the American election. Let's turn our attention to the subject of immigration. And by the way, if you want to call in to participate in the show live, we welcome your calls, toll free, anywhere in North America, 855-391-3661. The number again, 855-391-3661. That again is toll free, anywhere in North America. If you don't want to call using the phone, or if you are not in North America, you can always reach us by calling, or not by calling, but by going to www.callinstudio.com. That's callinstudio.com /show/JBA for Joseph Ben-Ami. So again, www.callinstudio.com /show/JBA. And that URL, by the way, if you're catching us on YouTube or Facebook Live or Rumble or any of those platforms, that should be in the comments section as well. And, you know, maybe what we'll do is we'll put it also up in the banner, the marquee, for people to see it there. So that's, I guess, a possibility as well. Okay, so as I was saying, I want to get into some discussion about immigration. And, you know, if you're in the United States or anywhere else other than Canada, this is a hot topic as well. In the United States, it's particularly a hot topic because of the open border, or the border crisis in the United States, the southern border. And I do not want to get into a discussion tonight about the border in the United States, because that's, to me, not the issue. The issue is broader than that. The issue is whether or not immigration is a net benefit or a net negative to the society that is practicing immigration or large-scale immigration. So to get into this, just to set the table a little bit, we recently had the government here in Canada revealed what its immigration targets are for upcoming years. And essentially what they've settled on is a target of 500,000 people, landed immigrants in Canada annually over the next few years. 500,000. And 500,000, by the way, does not include other categories of immigration. For instance, refugees. Now, we don't bring in hundreds of thousands of refugees, but we may welcome 35, 40, 50,000 refugees in a year. So that's refugees in addition to landed immigrants. We also are not counting with landed immigrants. We're not talking about foreign workers. We're not talking about foreign students. So there are a number of classifications of categories of people who come to Canada who are not coming and becoming landed immigrants. So that 500,000 already is going to be somewhere closer to 1 million plus. Now, do I have to say it? Do I have to say it? Maybe I do, so I will. I'm not immigrant. I'm not anti-immigrant. I hate saying that because it's sort of like, I don't know. It's so trite. It's why should I have to protest that I'm not anti-immigrant? Okay, father was an immigrant. I am the product of immigrants, as most of us are. So this is not whether immigration is actually good or bad. This is about whether or not the level of immigration and the character of immigration is good or bad. Immigration itself is neither good or bad. If your policy is that you want to increase the population and the indigenous, the people who are living there already, and here in Canada, for instance, our population is not growing at the rate you want it to grow, then immigration is a good thing. It fills a gap. It accomplishes a goal. So whatever the goal is, immigration can be part of that solution, could be part of your plan to achieve that goal. Does immigration add to an increased GDP per capita? I don't know. There are opinions on both sides of that argument. But let's say that your goal is to increase GDP per capita. You want economic growth. So you're gonna. You may think if you believe that immigration will help you achieve that, then you're going to bring in more people. So immigration is neither a good thing or a bad thing. It's an is thing. It just is, and it's a policy that we can adopt in order to achieve whatever our policy objectives are. Neither good or bad. But there are two problems with our current immigration policy, at least here in Canada, and I think that this is something that's been replicated in many countries, particularly in the Western world. And I say particularly in the Western world, I could probably say exclusively in the Western world. Because while I don't have any data to support the claim I'm about to make, let me say that it is really hard for me to believe that people are beating down the doors to get into communist China. I just don't believe that communist China has an immigration problem on any level. I don't believe that Korea, either South or North or even South Korea, have an immigration problem. I don't believe that Japan does. I don't believe that Vietnam does. I don't believe that Taiwan does. People if people are migrating, they want to migrate to a Western country. It is a uniquely Western country issue. Okay, people are not fleeing into India. And I don't mean to sound disrespectful to any of the countries that I've mentioned. I'm just saying that it's a fact that people who want to migrate to a Western country, like Canada, like the United States, like the UK or Germany or France or Italy, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Sweden. These are the countries that people want to migrate to. So these are the countries that are having to grapple with the whole question of immigration. How much and what kind? And those are the questions that need to be asked. That's the context of this discussion. Now, here in Canada, we're experiencing some rather serious economic problems, particularly in the area of housing. We are in the midst in Canada of what has been described by many people as a housing crisis, certainly a housing affordability crisis. And a big contributing factor to this problem is the fact that our population is growing at a rate faster than our capacity to build houses, to build infrastructure to accommodate that increase in population. And it's being driven by immigration. Now, the funny thing is, as I've mentioned, for those of you who don't know me, I've been in public policy and inside and outside of government for decades now. And I could tell you that this was an issue that we were sounding alarm bells on. It's 2024 now, so a quarter of a century ago. We were already saying that there were serious problems because we had ramped up our immigration numbers. Canada was a destination of choice, and becoming increasingly so at that time, 24 years ago, and so we were saying, look, this is potentially a problem. It's not a problem now, but it's going to potentially be a problem unless we find a way to ensure that there is careful coordination between the different provinces and the federal government and the private sector, that somehow we had to ensure that the number of people that we were bringing in, this was first and foremost, the number of people we were bringing in, that we were going to be able to accommodate them on a consistent long-term basis. That there had to be a coordination between capacity building, if I could use that term, building of houses, building of infrastructure, expansion of public services, all of the things that attracted people to coming to Canada. And this is not a Canadian problem uniquely. I'm just using Canada as an example. All of the issues that attracted, all of the items, the good things that attracted people to Canada, potentially, if there was no mechanism put in place to ensure that the number of people coming in was compatible with our capacity, or ability to build capacity to receive people, then we were going to have a problem. And at that time, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you, I don't have to tell you, you know what we had to put up with. Accusations of xenophobia, accusations of racism, accusations that we were anti-immigrant, okay, all of these things. Because it's easier rather than dealing with the issues that are in front of you. It's easier from a political point of view to just vilify your opponents. And then what the outcome of that was that people didn't want to hear what we have to say because they didn't want you to be lectured to by, these so-called racists, xenophobes, or far worse, at the political level anyway, many of my colleagues and friends on the conservative side of the political spectrum didn't want to talk about this stuff anymore because they didn't want to be called names. And they were worried about what would be the electoral consequences of being branded anti-racist, etc. So all of a sudden, the subject was off the table. Well, fast forward to the year 2024, where we have now in Canada a housing crisis. We have a crisis in Canada of bringing in so many people. And we're just talking about the numbers now. So many people that we are unable to keep up with the population increase in terms of building housing. And the consequence of that, of course, is that housing prices have just continued to climb because basic economics, ladies and gentlemen, supply and demand. If the demand is greater than the supply, then that puts upward pressure on the prices. if the supply is greater than demand, then it's going to be lower pressure, downward pressure. If the demand and supply are matched, then you're not going to have pressure up or down. So that's the ideal situation. But nobody was thinking about this, and now we're finding out that in fact there were experts, quote unquote, in the public service who were raising this issue a few years ago, at least a few years ago. But the government wasn't listening to them. That's the bottom line here. The government was not listening to the people that it pays, that we taxpayers pay, in order to pay attention to these things, and the government wasn't listening to them. And the government still isn't listening to them. Although, in fairness, the federal government here in Canada now is talking about putting a cap on foreign students. Well, the horses were already out of the barn. So I don't think that capping the number of foreign students is going to do it, ladies and gentlemen. We have to have a serious conversation about the number of people that we're bringing in as landed immigrants. Yes, if we were to reduce the number of foreign students that we're allowed to study in Canada, that would have a positive impact, I think, on our housing market, particularly the rental market. Okay? So I think I do think that that's part of the solution. But it's only a small part of the solution. The real issue is the people who are coming to settle here in Canada, who are going to want to rent apartments long term, who want to buy houses. A foreign student coming here to study for a year or 2 years or even 4 or 5 years likely isn't looking at buying a house unless they decide to stay here. Different issue. So I do think it's part of the solution, but the real issue, you gotta stop nibbling around the edges on these policy problems. You have to address them at their very core, and that the very core of this problem is the number of people that we're bringing into this country. Forget about the character of the people. Separate issue, and we will talk about that. But the number of people that we're bringing into the country. If we are not going to reduce that 500,000, then we're just whistling Dixie. Peeing in the wind, as somebody somewhat more crudely put to me once recently. If you have anything to say about this, feel free to join in. Toll free anywhere in North America, 855-391-3661. So this is a problem. This is a separate problem altogether from what you guys in the United States are experiencing on your southern border. That's a separate issue in and of itself. But even if you had that controlled, even if you had controlled immigration in the United States, you're still going to run into this problem. You have to ensure that the number of people, and this is one of the reasons why having control over immigration is so important, because you do have to have this coordination. There has to be some connection between the number of people that are coming into the country that are adding to the growth of the population and the availability, simply the availability of housing. This is why immigration has to be regulated. Regulated doesn't mean decreased. In this case, I think that it does as a practical matter, but in principle, regulated immigration doesn't mean increase or decrease. It just means monitored and ensured that whatever the numbers are, that we're able to accommodate them. That could, in principle, that could mean an increase. So this isn't about decreasing immigration. This is about getting our immigration levels correct. And this is a problem that we're facing not just in Canada, but you're facing it in the United States. and you're facing it in the UK, and you're facing it in France and Germany and all of the Western first world countries. So you have to get that number right. Now, I don't know what the number is. I don't know what the number is, ladies and gentlemen. I just know that there is a number that we should be aiming at for, and I think that 500,000, 500,000 for landed immigrants, I think is way too high. My guess is that probably we should be looking at reducing it down to even 200,000, perhaps even less than 200,000. I think that's, and we're just talking about the numbers issue here. We're going to get into, after the break, we'll get into the character issue, the cultural issue, which I think is vitally important as well. But I think that, at least in terms of numbers, irrespective of where people are coming from and what the character of immigration is, the people who are coming into our countries, I think that probably we're looking here in Canada at 200,000 or less, which is a huge cut. I get it. And there are a lot of people that are thinking they're going to come to Canada that maybe are not going to get the chance because of that. I get that as well. I feel bad to a degree, but, we have to do what's right because, we don't want the standard of living here in Canada or any of our other countries in the West to drop precipitously because of immigration, because that undermines the very reason why people want to come to our country in the first place. People don't want to come to our country and then discover they can't afford it or they can't find housing. And by the way, that is happening now in Canada. There are people who are moving to Canada, and then discovering that they can't afford to live here. And they're looking for options. And one of those options is to move away from Canada. But setting aside the numbers, there is another very serious issue here that we would be remiss if I wasn't addressing it. And in this respect, we are talking about something that probably is unique to Canada. Maybe not, I don't know. Maybe this is a problem in other countries as well. But here in Canada, ladies and gentlemen, if you're Canadian, you should be outraged by the fact that you are paying top dollar for researchers, for, bureaucrats, for public service experts. You're paying top dollar to get the best advice for the government from these people who are supposed to be nonpartisan. The irony is that if there's any partisanship here, it's left-wing partisanship. We all know that our public service is, by and large, left-wing. It leans liberal. So we have a liberal public service that is advising the government of the day to tone it down on immigration because they're saying, if we don't, we're going to have this housing crisis. And that was advice that the government was getting a number of years ago, and they didn't listen to it. Now, they don't have a legal obligation to listen to it, but they have certainly a moral obligation, an obligation to explain to us why we're paying the salaries of these experts as taxpayers, and you're not listening to them. And the consequence of not listening to them in this case is this housing crisis that we have here in Canada. Now, again, I don't know that this is a factor or a problem in any of the other countries that are experiencing high housing costs. But it's certainly a question that needs to be asked here. What is the point of paying a quote-unquote ostensibly neutral public service to advise if we're simply going to ignore their advice or their caution, their warnings? Because this is not, they were not making policy here. They were simply saying, look, the data says your policy, what you want to do, Liberal government, Trudeau government, let's not beat around the bush here, What you want to do, Mr. Prime Minister and Mr. Cabinet Minister, or Mrs. or Ms. Cabinet Ministers, what you want to do on immigration is a serious problem, and this is what the consequence is going to be. But they were ignored. So we're not even talking about here the government or the public service formulating policy. We're talking about them in a nonpartisan way raising the alarm about what the policy of this government was going to be, what the consequences, the results were going to be. That, in my view, is a very serious dereliction of duty on the part of the government. And if we had the same kind of procedures here that you have in the United States, where you have really powerful committees to investigate some of these things, this would be right on the top of my list. I want to know who knew, who had these documents, who had access to these recommendations, these warnings. Were they passed on to cabinet? What was the consequence? Like, what? Tell me what happened here. Who was warned, by whom, when, and why did the government continue to pursue this destructive policy when they ought to have known from their own advisors that this would be a problem? I don't have the answer to that, but it's scandalous, ladies and gentlemen. It is scandalous. And it should be treated as a scandal. Unfortunately, Canadians, I don't know. What can I say? We're not going to treat this as the scandal that it deserves to be treated as. All right, ladies and gentlemen, coming to the bottom of the hour, 9:30 here in Ottawa on Wednesday nights. So we're going to take another break, a final break, and we will be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show for our home stretch. Don't go away. We're having a lot of interesting conversation here, and you don't want to miss the final segment because we're going to get into some of the character issues with respect to our immigration policy. So stick with us. Back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Okay, we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Wednesday, January the 17th, 2024. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for sticking with us. We are into the home stretch. New format, 2-hour show. So we've had 90 minutes, and it's been fun. I hope that you haven't been too bored with the subjects, the items that we've been discussing. Okay, well, we're talking about immigration. I want to get into the question of the character of immigration. In the previous segment, we were talking about the numbers and what the effect of the higher numbers are when it comes to areas of issues pertaining to housing, sustaining public services, that kind of thing. But I want to talk about the character of immigration, because I think that that's a very important area that people they're not really comfortable discussing. If you want to join in the conversation, by the way, the number to call toll free is 855-391-3661. Anywhere in North America, the number again is 855-391-3661. Or if you prefer not to use your phone, or you're calling from somewhere outside of North America, then you may want to use your computer, audio, and microphone, in which case you just type in the URL www.callinstudio.com/ that's /show/JBA for Joseph Benamy. So the URL again is www.callinstudio, all one word, .com /show/JBA. Alrighty, so character of the immigrants. This is a sensitive topic, to be sure, but I think it's one that you have to talk about. If you're going to be bringing in a lot of people, ladies and gentlemen, you have to be able to have a discussion about who you're bringing in, and do these people believe in the same things that you believe in. Not perfectly. I'm a very big believer in free thought, free speech, diversity of thinking. I think that that's an incredibly important thing in a free society. But at the same time, any society is going to have some degree, has to have some consensus around core issues. And if you're not going to have that consensus, then how do you even have a functioning society? Oh, you could have functional societies in terms of the practical side of things. Well, the roads get cleared in the wintertime, which is a big deal in a country like Canada. Or they get built, period, which is a big deal, I guess, anywhere. And if you have healthcare that's government-run healthcare, is it run properly? Is healthcare available, private or not private? You have hospitals, you have doctors, you have grocery stores with groceries on the shelves. So those are sort of like the infrastructure issues, okay? As a practical matter, fine, all of these things function. But are you a functioning, cohesive society? And my argument is that if you want to preserve your society, then you have to be able to rally. You have to have consensus around some core principles. Now, here's a top of the list. In our country, or in the United States, or in the UK, or France, Germany, blah, 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 top of the list is personal liberty. We believe in personal, individual liberty. It doesn't mean we're all anti-government. I know I'm not anti-government. But we believe in the principle of individual liberty. We believe in civil liberties. That is a core principle, ladies and gentlemen. But not everybody in the world believes in individual liberty. There are people in this world, lots of people in this world, who think that our concept of individual liberty is actually a bad thing. So the question is this: what is the effect, what is the impact of bringing in thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of immigrants who potentially are ambivalent when it comes to questions of personal liberty? When it comes to equality between men and women, when it comes to questions of religious freedom, what are the consequences and the dangers to our society of bringing in large numbers of people who don't assimilate? And this is a key thing that you have to understand, ladies and gentlemen. If you come to Canada, or you come to the UK, or you come to the United States, and you're doing it because it's a free country, and you believe in the principles that these countries adhere to, also believe in, you're going to assimilate. You're going to learn the language. You're going to, you're just going to become, if you come to Canada, you're going to become a Canadian. If you come to Canada and you don't really believe in these principles, you don't adhere to them, you don't embrace them, they're not that important to you, or worse, okay, you don't agree with them, you're not going to assimilate. There might be some assimilation by osmosis, there might be some on the fringes, but by and large numbers of people are able to form communities that continue to foment hostility, or at best indifference, to these principles. And that's the problem, because eventually there's a critical mass of people who are formed. And we live in a free society, we live in a democratic society where people's opinions count. So what happens if you're a country like Canada, for instance? And I'm not citing data here. I'm just putting the issue out for people to think about, to discuss. If I live in a country like Canada, or we live in a country, and I do, there's no F, there's no if here, I live in Canada. But let's say in a country like Canada, with a relatively small population, we have only just hit 40 million people. So let's say we're bringing in, with all categories, 1 million people a year. In 10 years, that means 20% of Canadians, of people who are in this country, were not born here. And I don't know, I don't have the data in front of me, perhaps I should have, but I could find that data just even today. How many people who are living in Canada today, who are Canadian citizens, actually were not born here? What happens, ladies and gentlemen, hypothetically, what happens if that 20% or 15 or 20 or 25% of Canadians think that homosexuality should be a criminal offense? Now, I'm not talking about the moral aspect here. People are going to have their opinions on the moral aspect of the practice. We're not talking about the moral aspect of the practice. We're talking about the legal aspect. Should the practice of same-sex relations be legal? If you are gay, should you be subject to criminal prosecution? Well, there are a lot of people who are coming to Canada right now who think that that's the case. Who think that, yeah, of course it should be illegal. You should go to jail if you engage in same-sex relations. What happens if they become a large enough voting bloc that they are able to influence the government in that direction? After all, we're a free society. We're a democracy. You can see, ladies and gentlemen, and I just use that as an example. But you can easily see, I think, ladies and gentlemen, you can easily see how the very values, the very core principles of our society can easily be subverted, undermined, changed, if you will, if we are not paying attention to the character and the beliefs of the people that we're bringing into the country. So it's not just a numbers game, as we discussed in the in the last segment, I should say, of the show. It's not just a numbers game. It's a cultural game as well. There are cultural issues, and we have to be paying attention to those cultural issues. We have to be willing to say to people, you don't fit Canadian culture, and therefore we're not going to approve of your migrating to Canada. And I understand that that's going to hurt some people. That's for sure. That's going to step on people's toes. It's going to get people's feathers, ruffle people's feathers, get their knickers in a twist. Whatever cliche, whatever metaphor you want to use, that is, people are not going to be happy about that. But government isn't just supposed to be about keeping people happy. It's about making responsible decisions. And so when we talk about regulated immigration, we are talking about numbers, as we discussed in the last segment, because we want to ensure that we are able to accommodate the population growth that accompanies large-scale immigration. We have in Canada and in the United States and in many countries, but particularly here in Canada, we have no problem in terms of space. Canada is one of the great underpopulated lands of the world. So we have no problem bringing people in. We could everybody could come to Canada. Every 7 point whatever billion people are in the world, every single one of those people could come to Canada and we'd still have leftover space. But are we going to be able to accommodate those people if they come in large numbers? Because we have to build housing for people. We have to build infrastructure. And so we have to regulate the number of people who are coming to ensure that when they come, they're going to enjoy a standard of living that attracted them to Canada in the first place. And let's understand, okay, most people do not come to Canada because it's a freer country. There are those who come who are looking for a free country to put down roots. But most people in Canada most people who come to Canada are coming because they want to live in a country with a relatively high standard of living, a higher standard of living and quality of life than they are experiencing in the country where they're coming from. That's what most people migrate for. So we want to make sure that we are maintaining that standard of living and quality of life for the people who are coming here for that very reason. That's part of the regulation process. But the second reason why you want to regulate immigration is because you want to ensure that people who are coming into this country share the fundamental values that are at the foundation of our society. And that's a cultural issue. So there has to be some cultural compatibility. And I know, again, how controversial that is. But there's no sense in denying it. When we look at the riots that are going on right now, the mass demonstrations that are going on right now that are largely anti-Semitic, in Western capitals, large Western cities, and Western, I mean Western countries, cities in Western countries, it's a real issue. And you have to ask yourself, where is this coming from? Are we changing our culture? Is our culture changing? And what role does immigration play in that change in our culture? And remember, cultures don't change overnight. They take a period of time. It takes some time. It doesn't happen immediately. So that is a very real issue that we need to be concerned about. And we need to be concerned about it particularly because there are issues within Western culture that make it particularly susceptible to this kind of cultural takeover. And when I say takeover, it doesn't have to be planned. Change in culture isn't necessarily planned and executed. It happens over time naturally. So when you bring more and more people into Canada who don't share Canadian cultural values, but you keep on bringing them in, eventually that new culture will overwhelm the existing culture and replace it. This is a very real thing. It's happened over and over and over again throughout human history. There is nowhere that it's written in the great scheme of things, the great plan of the universe, that Canada will continue to exist long term for the next 400, 500 years as a Christian country, for instance. And I'm not saying this because I'm a Christian, because I'm not. But it's just simply an observation. If you think that Christianity has been good for Western culture, and I'm one of those people that does think that way, I think that that's one of the things that makes Canada a great country to live in, has been its Christian foundations, or if you want to call it Judeo-Christian foundations. But Canadians have largely, by and large, abandoned these principles. And as a consequence of that, I don't think that they're, if you're not practicing your culture, if you're not insisting on some cultural, defense is not perhaps the right word to use, but, robustness, if you will, assertiveness, then you are susceptible, you are vulnerable to being overwhelmed by those people from a different culture, let's just use your culture as a generic term. Your culture is at risk of being overwhelmed and taken over and replaced by other cultures that are more assertive, more lively, more vibrant and dynamic. And I think that we stand on that threshold today. So that's another reason why we want to be paying closer attention to our whole area of immigration. In the few minutes that we have left on the show tonight, there is one other angle that I think that we need to consider as well. And this is something that I actually haven't heard from anybody. I'm the only person that I know that has ever raised this, that I'm aware of. And that is what I call poaching, immigrant poaching. We have a very strong desire in Canada and in the Western world to welcome, to encourage the best and the brightest, to settle in our countries, to help to build our economy, our society. And we've benefited greatly from this, historically, throughout the Western world, the Western first world, let's say. But it doesn't come for free. There is a price to be paid, and we, of course, in the West, don't pay that price. Who pays the price are the people who are left behind in the societies, in the communities, in the countries and places where these immigrants come from. And I would say, and I don't know what the answer is to this, but I do think that it's worth putting out there for people to think about as well. What is the effect of what is essentially poaching the best and the brightest from those countries that need the participation, the leadership of the best and the brightest in order to rise up, to raise themselves up? Everything that, we'll call them the BBs, the best and brightest, the BBs, everything that they bring to Canada, everything they bring to the United States, everything they bring to the UK, France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, everything, talent, drive, character, ladies and gentlemen. All of these things could be put to use for the benefit of the communities from which they come, the countries they hail from. If you believe strongly in individual liberty, is there not a place for you to fight for individual liberty, to fight for social and political reform in your country, rather than simply pulling up stakes and moving to a country where we've already accomplished all of the things that have attracted you to us in the first place? Now, I'm not saying that, you shouldn't come to this country, but I am asking a question. Should we be going out of our way to recruit these people? Should we be, the word is poaching. Should we be poaching the best and the brightest? The BBs. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we're doing anybody any favors in doing that. And in fact, when you drain the brain trust, when you drain away the cream of society from some of these countries, you perpetuate the very social and political conditions that drive people away in the first place, that drive migration in the first place. So, in a very real sense, when countries say we're going to close our doors, except in the case of refugees, people who are literally escaping tyranny, you have to have some openness and some compassion. But just voluntary migration, should we be allowing people, should we be pursuing people in that level? Surely to goodness we understand that, if we were to say, no, stay in your country and build it, surely that's another way of dealing with the migration crisis that we see facing the Western countries today. Rather than just simply saying, we don't care, close the door, put up the barriers, pull down the blinds, lock the doors, the barbarians are at the gate. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But the other way of looking at it is to say, listen, cream of the crop, you guys should be staying in your country and you should be dealing with all of the issues that are feeding the migration crisis in the first place. And if you deal with those issues on the ground in some of these countries, you will be alleviating the migration crisis, won't you? Now, I'm a realist when it comes to policy. I know that I don't underestimate the magnitude of the task of anything that I talk about. So when it comes to this, the solutions for the migration crisis are long-term, complicated, and not very pretty in many cases. So I don't want people to think that I'm just being, facetious or trite or anything like that. I'm not. But I do think that this is, these are some of the important issues that need to be kept in mind when you're having a serious discussion about immigration policy. That's all. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is coming up to the top of the hour. So I just want to take a few minutes again, first of all, to thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you will tell your friends and neighbors about the show. And of course, you can always, as I said, check out the podcast, www.thejosephbenamyshow.com, and send me an email. There's a contact form right there you can use if you have any comments about the show. But I really want to thank you for tuning in. If you have any suggestions on topics, if you have any suggestions on format, I'd be more than welcome to read them. I do read all of my emails. And I hope you enjoy the format. I did enjoy doing it tonight. Hopefully in the future we'll get a little bit more participation from the public. Well, let's not beat around the bush. Maybe we'll get some participation from the public, other than the odd email that I got here during the show. But I'd be really happy if I get people to call in, because I want to hear what you have to say. I think we all do. Anyway, again, Happy New Year to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Joseph Benamy. We will catch you next week here on the Joseph Benamy Show.